If you want to become richer than almost everyone around you, the first thing you must make peace with is this. The path will look boring, not dull in the sense of meaningless. Dull in the sense that it will not flatter your fantasies, it will not feel cinematic, it will not give you the emotional sugar that financial media, trading culture, and get rich quick people love to sell. It will ask you to do a handful of plain things for a very long time, while other people chase novelty, excitement, urgency, and applause. That is why almost nobody sticks with it. And that is exactly why it works. When I was younger, I thought wealth would probably feel dramatic when it was happening. I imagined some great leap, a brilliant investment, a perfect business decision, a sudden turn in fortune, one decisive moment where the future would separate itself from the past, in a way even a young man could feel in his bones. Life taught me something else. The big fortunes people admire from far away are often built through years that felt strangely uneventful while they were being lived. Not easy years, not lazy years. Uneventful in the sense that the daily actions looked too plain to deserve the result they were quietly producing. That is why most people miss the truth. They are looking for a story. Wealth, in its early years, is usually a system. And systems are rarely exciting from the inside. If you begin at zero, or something close to it, the first thing you must understand is that your first real milestone is not mainly an investing game. It is a behavior game. People hate hearing that. They want the answer to be asset allocation, some clever fund, some hidden corner of the market, a special edge, a timing trick, an advanced method that allows them to believe the ordinary laws no longer apply to them. The ordinary laws still apply, especially at the beginning. If you start with little, the mathematics are almost insulting in their simplicity. Your first meaningful pile of capital is built much more by what you add than by what the market adds. The market helps later. It matters more later. But in the beginning, your behavior is the engine, and return is the assistant. That is a hard thing for people to accept, because it deprives them of fantasy. But fantasy is expensive. Arithmetic is not emotional. It does not care how motivated you feel. It does not care how intelligent you are. It does not care how many books you have read, or how many charts you can explain, or how many financial opinions you have collected. It asks only a few plain questions. How much comes in? How much goes out? How much remains? How often is what remains invested? How long is the process sustained without panic, boredom, sabotage, or self-deception? That is the real beginning. It is not glamorous enough for the culture, it is powerful enough for reality. If I were speaking to someone who wanted to build his first 100,000 from scratch, I would tell him to forget almost everything noisy people are currently shouting about. Forget the brilliant entry. Forget the perfect market. Forget the fantasy that a handful of lucky trades will turn undisciplined living into freedom. Start with numbers, not vibes, not hope, not vague ambition. Numbers. One of the most important changes in a person's financial life happens when the goal stops being emotional and becomes measurable. I have seen this again and again in business, investing, and personal finance. The human mind can drift inside a dream for years. It becomes much harder to drift once the dream has been translated into specific arithmetic. If you say, "I want to get rich," you are still in the land of wishes. If you say, "I want $100,000 in 5 years, and I know exactly what that requires each month, each week, and each working day," you have crossed into a very different territory. Now you are dealing with structure that matters more than people think, because vague goals feel noble but behave like fog. Specific goals often feel smaller and less romantic, but they become actionable. And action is what changes balance sheets. Suppose you want $100,000 in a year. Fine, the number sounds exciting, but once you calculate it, the fantasy begins getting stripped away. $100,000 in a year means around $273 every day of the year. If you think in working days instead, it climbs even more. Suddenly, the goal is no longer an identity statement. It is an operating burden. It is asking you whether your time, your skills, your savings rate, and your life structure can actually support that pace. That is not meant to discourage you. It is meant to sober you. Sober people do better with money than inspired people who refuse arithmetic. Maybe you then decide that 3 years is the right horizon. Maybe 5. Good. Now you are beginning to work backward instead of merely wishing forward. You are beginning to see what the target demands from you in daily reality. That is one of the most boring and one of the most life-changing things you can do. Write the number down, write the path down, write the monthly requirement down, write the daily requirement down, put it where your eyes have to trip over it. People have an odd relationship with written goals. They call them obvious, and then avoid the discipline of making them concrete. But what is obvious in theory is often transformative in practice. A written number begins behaving like a mirror. It tells you, without pity and without insult, whether your current life is in conversation with your stated ambition or merely reciting it. That is the first law of boredom. Define the numbers so clearly that your excuses lose room to hide. Once you have done that, the second law becomes unavoidable. You must make yourself harder to replace. This too sounds simple. And because it sounds simple, people underestimate how much money lives inside it. The market pays for scarcity, not moral worth, not effort in the abstract scarcity. If what you do can be done by almost anyone, with minimal friction, at scale, under pressure, or soon by software and systems, trained on the work of millions, then you may still earn a living, but you should not expect the market to reward you with unusual generosity. People want to believe income is mostly about effort because that belief feels fairer. Income is often much more about how replaceable the effort is. This is why a mediocre person with a scarce skill can sometimes earn much more than a brilliant person with a common one. And it is why some of the smartest people in society become beautifully educated workers rather than wealthy owners. The world rewards usefulness under scarcity, not merely intelligence under evaluation. If you want your net worth to rise faster, you need either more income, less spending, or some combination of both. And the cleanest way to raise income without depending on luck is to become difficult to substitute. That could mean becoming elite inside a profession where true expertise is rare. It could mean building a trade skill that technology cannot yet imitate, and that households or businesses cannot postpone for long. It could mean becoming exceptionally good at communication in a world filling up with machine-generated sameness. It could mean learning how to sell, negotiate, write, close, explain, teach, or persuade at a level that separates you from the mass of competent but forgettable people. I want to pause on that last point because it matters more than people think. We are entering a world where average communication is becoming easier to generate and therefore less valuable. When average becomes abundant, personal signal becomes scarce. The person who can still write with a point of view, speak with force, connect with trust, and move other human beings emotionally and commercially may become more valuable, not less. That is not because technology fails, it is because uniformity lowers the market value of uniform work. Scarcity always returns. This is what you should ask yourself with ruthless honesty. What do I know how to do that is hard for a machine to imitate? Well, what do I know how to do that is hard for another person to replace quickly? What do I know how to do that creates enough value for somebody else that they would feel pain if I disappeared? That is the territory where higher income becomes possible. Many people never ask those questions properly. They simply continue doing what is available, familiar, or approved, then wonder why their financial life feels capped. Markets cap the replaceable. They bid aggressively for the scarce. That is the second law of boredom. Become rarer than your current income suggests. Now let us talk about spending, because this is where good intentions usually go to die. There is a very old human habit of treating income as the interesting side of the equation and spending as the annoying side. That is a disastrous bias. If your goal is your first meaningful capital base before your first 100,000, every dollar not spent has a kind of power that people only fully appreciate later. The dollar you do not spend is not merely a dollar retained. It is a dollar that can become stored time, future margin, optionality, psychological safety, and eventually a worker in your service. That makes spending decisions much more important than people want them to be. I do not believe in misery as a wealth strategy. A life built entirely on deprivation often becomes financially disciplined and emotionally unstable, which is not a stable combination. People eventually rebel against austerity if austerity feels like an attack on identity rather than a clear transfer from present impulse to future freedom. So I am not asking for self-punishment, I am asking for seriousness. Most spending is not the result of rational life design. It is the result of convenience, impulse, fatigue, imitation, and the quiet pressure of wanting life to feel easier than it actually is. That is why one of the most effective rules I know is the cooling off rule. Put a delay between desire and payment. For any non-trivial purchase, create a wall of time. It could be 24 hours, it could be longer for bigger decisions. The exact duration matters less than the principle. Give your better judgment time to catch up with your impulse. You will be amazed how many purchases evaporate once they are forced to survive a night of reflection. That is not stinginess. It is refusing to let mood run your balance sheet. Another dull and powerful practice is substitution. Make the coffee at home. Simplify the restaurant order, skip the unnecessary ad. On search for the cheaper version of the same utility. Ask whether the pleasure is actually in the thing or merely in the ritual around it. A great many people do not need less life, they need less leakage. Leakage is what keeps ordinary earners from becoming capital owners. And if you are serious about reaching 100,000, you should not be studying only your small leaks. You should stare hardest at the big drains: housing, cars, food. These three absorb enormous parts of household life. Optimizing the small while ignoring the large is one of the most common forms of fake prudence. If your lease is ending, ask harder questions than comfort usually allows. Could a roommate change the next 2 years of your financial life? Could living a little farther away create a spread large enough to matter? Could the difference between one housing choice and another become several $100s a month that goes not into the landlord's account, but into the first real capital you have ever owned? People underestimate how large that difference becomes over time. $500 a month feels like a budgeting detail. Over years, it becomes a different life. The same with cars. A great many people are driving their freedom around while owing. That is not the same as wise. If your vehicle payment is stealing the exact savings rate that would have built your first real base, then the car is not just transport, it is a slow theft of optionality. Insurance, fuel, maintenance, depreciation, financing, the total burden matters. If a cheaper, reliable alternative exists, and it frees cash that can be turned into assets, then you are not downgrading your life, you are redirecting it. Food is the same in 1,000 smaller ways. Convenience is expensive, habit is expensive, social eating is expensive. Most people do not realize how much emotional spending gets disguised as nourishment. Once you notice it, you do not need to become joyless. You simply need to become deliberate. That is the third law of boredom. Protect the spread between what you earn and what your life consumes. The fourth law is where things get quietly powerful. Automate the right behavior. I have never believed that financial success should depend on daily heroism. Heroism is unreliable. Mood is unreliable. Motivation is unreliable. People like to talk as though the right life comes from enough discipline, exercised in enough moments. In practice, a better life often comes from building an environment where the right action happens before the weaker part of you gets a vote. That is why automation matters so much. If your salary arrives and the first movement of money is toward your future rather than toward your impulses, your odds improve dramatically. Not because you became a saint, because you stopped inviting temptation into every payday. Pay yourself first. That phrase has been repeated so often people no longer hear how radical it is. What it means in practice is that your future self becomes your first obligation, not the remainder left behind after the present self has finished negotiating with every appetite, advertisement, insecurity, and convenience within reach. If you earn $2,000 every 2 weeks and $400 leaves automatically for savings or investment before the rest of the money settles into your lifestyle, then a great deal of self-sabotage is cut off before it begins. You are using structure instead of willpower. Structure almost always beats willpower over long periods. It is strange how rarely people apply this insight beyond their careers. They know environment shapes behavior in almost every other part of life. But when money is involved, they suddenly start talking as though daily restraint alone should carry the burden. It should not. Good systems do more for wealth than good intentions. The person who automates wise behavior is not colder than the person who intends to save manually. He is simply more realistic about human nature. That is the fourth law of boredom. Remove as many daily financial decisions as possible from the courtroom of mood. And now we come to the fifth law, which is the hardest of all because it asks almost nothing from your talent and almost everything from your patience time. People consistently underestimate how emotionally difficult time is in finance. Not because time is complicated, because time is silent. You can play a sport and know instantly whether the shot was good. You can cook a meal and know quickly whether it worked. You can send an email and receive a reply, but wealth in its early formation often offers no satisfying emotional feedback. You budget more carefully, you become harder to replace, you cut leakage, you automate, you invest, and after a few months, perhaps even a year, the visible results still feel smaller than the effort seemed to deserve. This is the great discouragement zone. It ruins many perfectly sound plans. People look at the account, look at the sacrifices, and conclude the machine is not working. They do not understand that the machine often works in secret before it works in public. That is one of the deepest truths of compounding. Progress is mathematically real but emotionally unimpressive. This is especially true for the first 100,000. Let us be honest about the arithmetic. If you save and invest $15,000 a year and earn around 4.5%, you can reach roughly 100,000 in about 6 years. But most of that did not come from dazzling returns. It came from what you deposited. If you earn a much stronger return, say 10%, you may get there in 5 years. But the savings still do most of the heavy lifting. Even at a spectacular rate, the first 100,000 is still mostly a story about inputs, not miracles. That is why people who worship return too early often stay broke. They are trying to use investment excitement to replace behavioral consistency. The market does not reward that substitution. The first 100,000 is a savings and system game wearing the costume of an investment goal. That is why it is so boring, and that is why it changes lives. By the time most people give up, they were often much closer to escape velocity than they realized. The boring years were not empty, they were loading the spring. That is the fifth law of boredom. Do not misread silence as failure. 4 years will pass, 5 years will pass, 7 years will pass. Time is going to move whether you build with it or merely age inside it. That is the most sobering and the most hopeful fact in this whole subject. The future does not care whether you have a coherent system. It will arrive anyway. The only question is whether it arrives to find that you built numbers, scarcity, frugality, automation, and patience into something solid, or whether it arrives to find that you remain financially fluent only in consumption and excuses. That is the question beneath all the numbers. And I think it matters more than people admit. I also want to say something about return, because this is where beginners often get seduced into the wrong emotion. They think the way to become rich faster is to find the magic investment. Occasionally somebody gets lucky. Occasionally a business takes off. Occasionally a side venture suddenly changes the whole path. Good, that can happen. I am not denying possibility. But you cannot build a reliable life on lucky exceptions. A sound plan must still work in an ordinary world. That is what makes it sound boring. It has to be able to survive without drama. If your plan depends on a 20% annual return, a viral side hustle, a perfect market entry, or a heroic business leap, then you may have a fantasy, not a system. I would much rather see a person build a life that becomes steadily richer under sober assumptions than a life that remains fragile while waiting for one brilliant break. Fragility is the most expensive form of optimism. This is why I return to the same sequence again and again. Know the number, raise your market value, cut the leakages that matter. Automate your future, stay long enough for boredom to become wealth. That is the path. Not because it sounds exciting, because it matches how lives actually change. I have often noticed that the people who later looked disciplined and inevitable were often just the people who learned to respect plain arithmetic before others did. They were not always wiser in every domain. They simply stopped bargaining with reality. They accepted that if wealth was a system, the system had to be built even on days when there was no applause. That is not a small thing. It is one of the rarest forms of adulthood. So many people want wealth to appear as a visible reward for becoming the kind of person they admire. The world is not that poetic. Wealth often appears as the delayed reward for becoming the kind of person who can repeat sensible behavior when nothing in the environment is cheering him on. That person rarely looks exciting. He looks consistent, he knows his numbers, he is becoming more valuable. He is not casually bleeding cash in the big categories. He does not require a fresh surge of motivation every payday. He has made the right action easier than the wrong one. He trusts time even while time is still too early to flatter him. That is what richer than anyone you know often looks like in the beginning. It looks plain. That is why the crowd misses it. The crowd notices the millionaire after the compounding is visible. It rarely notices the ordinary, disciplined, slightly dull looking behaviors that built the base from which compounding could eventually become dramatic. But that is where the real story always lives. The real story is that explosive net worth growth usually begins in a period where growth does not yet look explosive at all. It begins with a person who finally understands that the first 100,000 is not won by genius. It is won by boring arithmetic executed hard enough and long enough that money finally begins to move in your life like a second worker instead of a constant emergency. That is what you are really building, not a number alone, a second worker. At first, that worker is weak. It cannot carry much. It barely moves. You do almost all the lifting yourself. Then slowly the worker becomes useful. Then one day, if you stayed long enough, the worker becomes strong enough that you finally understand why people talk about money working for them. It was never magic, it was boredom made visible. And once you understand that, you stop resenting the dullness of the path. You begin respecting it. If I could leave you with one final thought, it would be this. Do not ask whether the path feels exciting enough to be worthy of your ambition. Ask whether the path is structurally sound enough to make your ambition inevitable, if you remain faithful to it. That is the better question. Excitement is cheap, inevitability is expensive. And the price of inevitability, for the first real stretch of wealth, is usually 5 boring laws followed for longer than most people think is reasonable. That is why it works. That is why so few do it. And that is why, if you can truly make peace with it, this boring path may in fact make you richer than almost anyone you know.